This is a video on how to find the inverse of functions algebraically. Take good notes because you never know, you might be able to use your notes on your retake. All right, by now you should already know that for a function and its inverse, the following are always true. The x and y values are switched. The domain and ranges are switched. If you're looking at the graph of the original function and the graph of its inverse on the same coordinate plane, they are reflections of each other around y equal x. And the inverse of a function may not be a function. You need to apply the vertical line test to determine if it is in fact a function. But how do you find the inverse of a function algebraically? Well, there are just 3 steps. Let's take a look at those steps with examples. So the first step is you got your original function, f of x is equal to 2x plus 1. You switch the x and the y. Literally, you switch the x and the y. Step 2, you solve for y. So you all know how to solve equations. You're going to work from the outside in. So here we're going to subtract 1 from both sides, and then we're going to divide both sides by 2, and we end up with x minus 1 divided by 2 is equal to y. And last, we rewrite that using inverse notation. So you know that y is the same as f of x. So the inverse of y is f to the negative 1 power of x is equal to x minus 2. Stop now, pause now, and take good notes of this example. All right. So let's look at another example. If we started with g of x is equal to 4x squared minus 7, then we would switch the x and the y. The steps never change. What changes is what you have to do to solve for y. It completely depends on what kind of function you started with. So in this case, we started with a quadratic. The opposite of a quadratic is a square root. So we should be looking to end up with some kind of square root function. So here we go. We're going to work from the outside in. That means we're going to add 7 to both sides. And then we're going to divide both sides by 4. And now we have something equal to y squared. How do we undo a square? We take the square root. And I want you to remember and take note that whenever you take the square root, when you're solving, you always want to include plus and minus. Very important. Make sure you have that well documented in your notes. Now that we have solved for y, our last step is just to write that using inverse notation. And we are done. Now, one more example. We switch the x and the y. This time, we started with a quadratic. So we are going to end up with a square root of some kind. So we are going to work our way outside in. We're going to add 1 to both sides, divide both sides by 3, and then take the square root. Well, this time we have y minus 2 on this side, so we need to go ahead and add 2 to both sides, giving us y is equal to plus or minus, don't forget that, the square root of x plus 1 over 3, and then on the outside of the radical is the plus 2. And last, we write that in inverse form. Now, this one, I got my animation a little bit mixed up. So let's start up here. We have g of x is equal to negative square root of x minus 4 plus 5. So this time, we started with a square root function, which means the opposite of square root, you get rid of that by squaring. Our inverse is going to be something squared. We should be looking for that. So let's start with the first step. We're going to switch x and y, and then we're going to solve for y. Now, working from the outside in, we first subtract 5 from both sides, and then we're going to divide both sides by -1. Got to get rid of that negative here if we're going to solve for y. And now we have negative x plus 5 is equal to the square root of y minus 4. Well, to get rid of a square root, we need to square. And whatever we do on one side, we do on the other. So we're going to square both sides. And that gives us y minus 4 on this side. We're trying to isolate y, so let's add 4 to both sides. And that gives us y is equal to negative x plus 5 squared plus 4. And we're down to our last step, which is writing it in inverse form. Now, at this point, you should have detailed notes on how to find the inverse of a function algebraically for 4 examples, but for some examples. You should be able to show evidence of your learning by doing similar practice problems and showing all of your work. And if you do not feel comfortable with this, watch the video again, pause frequently to make sure you understand each step, and have detailed notes. And of course, you can always post questions or email me if you have questions about what is going on any of these problems. See you later.